No matter which Pokemon game you play, chances are you will enjoy it for a very long time. Recently, it's become a growing hobby of video game enthusiasts to buy old game consoles and play their favorite games not on emulators, but on the real deal. If you want to play the older Pokemon games on a real Game Boy or Nintendo DS, what exactly would it cost you? To give you a rough idea, I've created this video. Let's lay down some ground rules. The biggest is that this list is not definitive. People's interests change constantly, meaning games like the original Ruby and Sapphire, which are popular right now due to their recent 3DS remakes, may not be popular a few years down the line. This is just an approximation of what these games are worth right now. Secondly, all these prices come from eBay. While you can easily get all the Generation 6 games at practically any store that sells video games, and you might luck out into finding Generation 5 or even a Generation 4 game, odds are you will always be able to find them cheaper used online. Speaking of used, each of these games comes with two sets of prices, what they cost used and what they cost new in box. To define both, I'm calling the game used when the listing clearly marks that the game has a brand new battery for the Game Boy games. New is when it is clearly specified that the box is still shrink wrapped, which means it's 100% guaranteed to have never been played before. One last thing, all prices are in US dollars. With those rules out of the way, let's go ahead and look at all the main series Pokemon games ranked from the cheapest to the most expensive. At the bottom of the list is probably not one that I would have guessed, Pokemon Black 2 and White 2. My guess is the reason these are so cheap is because, well, if you wanted them, you probably had them by now. A lot of people got these within the first year of their release, which was a whole 4 years ago now, believe it or not. And many of us have decided either to keep them or to sell them. There are very few people out there who want these games and don't have them yet. If you're one of the people who doesn't have these, it'll cost you about $20 used and $35 new. The next one up on the list is the most recent Pokemon games, Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Same thing as Black 2 and White 2. If you want these, you probably have them by now. You can easily find these games in just about any store for $40, but if you want to go the cheapest route, go to eBay. $30 used, $35 new. Up next are the first games in Generation 5, Pokemon Black and White. These games are a little harder to come by, and it's unlikely for you to find them in any given store, so these are truly the first games on this list where you'll have to buy them secondhand, either on eBay or stores like GameStop. My best pricing estimates are that you can find Black and White used for about $20 and new for about $40. Next is Pokemon X and Y. These wildly popular games, they sold over 14 million copies, are the most popular games ever for the Nintendo 3DS. You're still guaranteed to find these in just about any store for $40 new, but you can probably find a cheaper one on eBay or in a store like GameStop for only about $30, in the unlikely event you don't have it yet. Now is where the games begin to get a little more expensive. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, if you're lucky, you can find used on eBay for about $20. However, it's virtually impossible to find them in any retail stores since they're basically sold out at this point. Nintendo's not making any more. If you want one that has never been opened before, it's going to cost you a total of $75, and that's only if you're lucky. Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver are a little worse. It'll cost you $35 used and $80 new. And the catch with these games is that in order to buy it new, it needs to come in the original box that also includes the Pokewalker, which is used in conjunction with the game. If it wasn't for that, these would probably be a little on the cheaper side, but you know, you gotta have that Pokewalker, guys. Just trust me on this. You will love it. I promise. One thing I forgot to mention is that third version games are completely separate on this list for one very big reason. Usually, they're more popular, which means that they're going to be a little more expensive. Case in point, Pokemon Platinum. When you buy this used, it's actually just $20 like Diamond and Pearl. However, if you wanted to buy it new, it'll be a total of $140, or roughly twice as much as Diamond and Pearl. The reason for this is that Platinum was extremely popular, and basically everyone bought out the entirety of Nintendo's stock, so the only copies of this game that are still shrink-wrapped are in people's collections that they're a little unwilling to part with. So yeah, Platinum is the first 3-digit game on this list, and it won't be the last. Since Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are the most recent games to come out, enthusiasm has risen for the original Ruby and Sapphire. There are two main problems with the Game Boy games. One is that it was incredibly easy, unfortunately, to create fakes of these games that worked like the real thing but were not made by Nintendo or Game Freak. Another is that the battery tended to run dry after a while, so you have to take the cartridge apart to put in a new battery. That itself is not tedious or expensive, but it does mean that if you want to play a completely original, untouched, untainted copy of the game, you're going to have to buy it new, which does dramatically raise the price to $150 for a shrink-wrapped copy of Ruby and Sapphire. If you want it used with a new battery in it, it's one of the cheapest games on this list at only $15. However, if you want to make 100% sure that it's never been played before, you gotta buy it new, and that'll raise the price tenfold. Crazy, huh? Not nearly as crazy as Pokemon Emerald. This thing is on the opposite sides of both spectrums, only $13 used, which is by far the cheapest game on this list. So if you have a Game Boy and you want a cheap game, get Emerald. It's only $13, which is less than a third of the original sell price. But if you want it new, again, the whole thing with the battery thing and Emerald was extremely popular, so it's going to raise it up to a total of $175, which is, believe it or not, the average for a new in-box price for most of the games on this list. Luckily, all the Generation 3 games are bundled pretty closely on this list, because up next is Pokemon Firered and Leafgreen. This is another one of those games that comes with a special little extra thing in the box, which is why the brand new price for this is at $175. This comes with the link cable, which you can use to connect between two Game Boys, both playing a copy of Firered or Leafgreen, to play extra minigames between two friends. The brand new in-box price is $175 once again, but if you don't care for the link cable, you can find a good used price of only $15. Going all the way back to Generation 2, up next on the list is Pokemon Gold and Silver. The battery problem is extremely important in this generation because this generation introduced the clock mechanic, and that used the internal battery. The battery only lasted for about 7 years, so you have to switch out the battery, which is even harder to do for an original Game Boy game than it was for the Game Boy Advance games. The cheapest used copy of Gold and Silver will run you at about $30, or roughly the price of what a brand new game would cost you nowadays. If you want a game that is still in its box, and thus has the original battery in it, you guessed it, $175. Crystal is not much better. Since this was a Game Boy Color exclusive game, that means that the battery was going to run drier even sooner due to it only ever being played on a Game Boy Color instead of alternating between that and an original Game Boy. This means that while the new price is identical to Gold and Silver, the used price is a whopping $50. That's the absolute cheapest you can get this game, and the highest on this list for a used Pokemon game in general. That's just insane. And if you thought that was bad, wait till we get to the final two games. Let's start with Pokemon Yellow. When you get to the Generation 1 games, you run into the problem of, these were the originals. These are the ones that everyone wants to play. Never mind that the Virtual Console games are coming out in just a month, people will want to play these games on an original Game Boy in the way that they were originally made. As such, Pokemon Yellow, since it's one of the most popular Pokemon games in all of history, is going to run you about $45 used, or $250 if it's still in the box with shrink wrap all over it. That's just incredible, and if you thought that was bad, let's get to the absolutely most expensive game on this list, Pokemon Red and Blue. Aw, the classics. It is so hard to find these days. People are just very unwilling to give these up because, let's face it, they're awesome games. So if you are lucky enough to find one on eBay, it'll cost you $40 used. Now, here's something to consider. There are not many copies of these games that are still in their box with the shrink wrap all over it. It was impossible for us to know back 20 years ago that these games would be so popular that people would still want to play them decades later. As such, there are not many copies of these games left in a box, and if you were lucky enough to find one, it would cost you, get ready, $400. That easily makes it one of the most expensive Game Boy games of all time, and the most expensive Pokemon game on this list. So if you want an untouched copy of Red and Blue to play on your Game Boy, prepare to save up for a few months because it is going to take a while to buy it. That does it for this list. I hope you all enjoyed. If there's any suggestions for future lists that you want me to do, be sure to leave it in the comments below. Thanks everyone for watching, and stay tuned for more.